I'm honored to open this session of the conference that will deal with the question of the philosophical moral debate of whether how to deal with wars, how you can engage in wars in democratic society. I'll just say some few words in the beginning. The question of the way the democratic society, democratic state should deal its war has become a very important field in the last 30, 40 years. It started during the Vietnam War, and one of the major works that was written, maybe the major work that was written by Professor Michael Walzer, that is here, Just and Unjust War. After the work in Iraq and Afghanistan, it became part, as Michael Walzer said in arguing about war, became part of the way the generals are working in the field itself. Israeli society also deals with this question a lot. It was in the last war in the Gaza Street. There was a huge debate about the issue. How to deal with the war. Just and unjust war is problematic today, especially when you engage war not against an army, but against a terrorist group that works within civilians. So it becomes much more complicated. Two of the major principles of just war theory is that you should engage in war only proportionally, and you have to discriminate between different people, between people who fight the war, warriors, and people who are civilians. Today, both become more and more problematic, so this will be part, or I guess, in the main framework of the discussion. Also in Jewish theory, if you go back to the Tanakh and Chazal, you can find, if you want, and you work deeply in it, as Professor Avi Ravitsky has shown and Professor Stuart Cohen has shown, you can find different sources to different approaches how to deal with war, through realistic approaches, through idealistic approaches. So this is also very, very important today from a Jewish perspective. I would like to ask Professor Asa Kasher to start. Professor Asa Kasher is working profoundly on this topic. He worked in the Ethic Code of the Army during 1995 and worked with the General Yadlin. By the way, that the Israeli IDF should engage the warfare, and it became also known to the public. He wrote profoundly a lot about war and ethics. He is a professor emeritus from Tel Aviv University, and he got the Israeli prize, so I would like to ask him to start. We have 20 minutes. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this interesting conference, and particularly this panel. There is, as the chairman has just said, an ongoing debate concerning the ethics of fighting terrorism. In some sense, Major General Yadlin and myself started it by proposing a doctrine, presenting it to the IDF and the General Security Service during the mid-2000 years, and publishing it in two journals, one Journal of Military Ethics and the other one a Journal on International Relations published by Johns Hopkins University. And there is an ongoing debate. There is vast agreement among participants in this debate concerning almost all the issues involved. However, some important differences and disagreements have remained. It seems that one of the best ways, perhaps the best way to advance understanding is to discuss it with Professor Michael Walzer, and I'm very delighted to be able to do it. We did it on Sundays on some other campus, but I won't continue the Sunday debate. I'll just start from scratch for the benefit of the present audience who was not there. Okay, just war doctrine, conventions of international law. Much of military ethics, what goes under the title military ethics, involved discussions on the level of international relationships. If you just think about the proportionality and the distinction principles that have just been mentioned, I mean, we think of them in terms of what may one state or the military forces of one state do to citizens of another state, combatants or non-combatants. It's one party against the other party in the same war. I would like to use a different starting point for the present discussion, and not to use the level of international relationships, external relationship from the point of view of the state. I'd like to start from the point of view of internal relationships. That is to say, the relationship between a government or the state, because it's the government of the state, the relationship between the state and its people, persons, men and women in military uniform, and the relationship between commanders and the troops. So it's not going to be a discussion on the level of international relationships. It's going to be a discussion about intranational relationships. The present format I'd like to give my presentation is that of questions raised by a conscript. Most of the combatants in Israel are conscripts or people on reserve duty, and they have a constitutional right, although our constitution is problematic, but the notion constitutional right is not. So they have a constitutional right to raise issues concerning the extent to which the state protects them, protects its own citizens when they are under consideration. So the conscript has questions, and I'd like to mention some of the questions raised by the soldier. We call them in Israel soldier, but for the Americans in the audience, it applies to sailors and marines and pilots as well. Everyone here is a soldier. Okay, so the Israeli soldier or a soldier under similar conditions elsewhere have constitutional rights to raise questions. By constitutional, by the way, I don't mean just the legal level of raising issues, but the level of the moral principles that are embodied in a constitution of a democratic state. Okay, question number one. I'll start with easy questions, then we'll get to the question concerning terrorism. Question number one, why do I have a duty to serve in the IDF as conscripts in the first place? Okay, it's not self-evident that people are conscripts. In most of the democratic world, that there are no conscripts, and there are hardly reserve duties of the type that we are familiar with in Israel. So it's a good question, because protecting human dignity means protecting liberties, and conscription is incompatible with ordinary liberty that we enjoy as citizens. So there must be a very good reason for applying principles of conscription to young people, men and women in Israel. There is a good answer. There isn't even an easy answer. It's a necessity. Under the standard conditions in which Israel finds itself, it is a necessity because it is the duty of the state to defend its citizens against all kinds of enemies, potential enemies, and real enemies. And there is no other way of doing it but to use the principles of conscription. So we have to defend the citizens, their life, their well-being, their autonomy. For that we need a military force, and military force in Israel cannot consist just on career officers and NCOs, so there is conscription, reserve duties. Okay, however, it is a democracy, so conscription should be conducted in a fair way. Is it conducted in Israel in a fair way? Answer, no. It's not done in a fair way. First of all, there is a distinction between men and women. Then there is a distinction between non-ultra-Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. And those distinctions cannot be really justified in a fully fledged manner. However, it's almost all right. Okay, we are in the process of fixing the differences between men and women in the military forces. And we are in an historic process of fixing the problem of the distinction between ultra-Orthodox and the rest. Eventually, those two problems will be solved in a decade or so. The problem of women earlier. Okay, question number two. Why is my life jeopardized by the state every once in a while in a certain place near Gaza, near southern Lebanon, or elsewhere? Again, the answer is easy. It's a necessity under certain conditions. Under certain conditions, we have to jeopardize your life, dear soldier, for the following reason. I mean, we mentioned already the reason, but there are conditions that should be satisfied. The reason is self-defense of the state against its enemies, defending the state and its citizens. Secondly, we are not going to send you to jeopardize your life unless it's last resort. Now, last resort is an example. I mean, usually we think about last resort as a principle in international relationships, but I'm using last resort as an argument within the state. The state may send its troops to jeopardize their life in the battlefield only if there is no other way of solving the problem, the security problems of the state. So last resort is also an internal argument, not only an external argument. Military necessity, we cannot defend the people otherwise. Again, it's on both levels. Then we provide you as much as we can with all kinds of technical shields. The tank, the famous Israeli tank Merkava, is a very efficient, more than any other tank in the world, in protecting the crew. There is the Iron Dome that has recently been introduced into the battlefields. And there are many other technical shields of pilots, of infantry soldiers, which the state owes them. I mean, do the best you can in order to protect me, to lower the level of jeopardy to my life. And finally, there is the political shield. I mean, pursuit of peace. Peace is the best protection of the soldiers. I mean, soldiers don't get killed. Israeli soldiers have not been killed in battles with the military forces of Egypt since we signed the treaty with the agreement with Egypt. That's the ultimate protection of soldiers, peace. So again, we need peace on an international level. We can say a lot about it, but we need peace on an internal level as well. That's the ultimate protection of people in military uniform against a certain enemy. Okay, those were the easy questions. Now, question number 3. Why is my life being presently jeopardized by my commander under some tactical circumstances? Now, there are different possible answers. One answer is, again, military necessity. Given the nature of the mission, for example, elimination of sufficiently many guerrilla units that shell Israel, send Katyushas from southern Lebanon over Israel. Okay, we cannot solve such a problem to the extent possible at all when you face guerrilla forces. We cannot solve the problem by shelling villages or by air raiding them. Even if you destroy houses, I mean, the guerrilla units are going to go on shelling the population of northern Israel from those ruined houses. So we must introduce armor and infantry and engineering units into the area, and all that means jeopardizing the life of the troops. So troops are going to face risk because of military necessity, and everything in the background is, as I mentioned it earlier, it's self-defense, it's last resort, and all the other conditions are fulfilled. So there can be a good answer on the tactical level on grounds of considerations of military necessity. Now, what about the other possible answer that is prevalent in the public discussion? Legal or moral necessity, not military necessity, but just a legal and moral one, allegedly. So consider a situation and let's see how we can face it. We can face it. Assume that there is a house somewhere in the Gaza Strip, not very close to the border, between Israel and that part of the Palestinian territories. It's a house, it's full of terrorists, they shell Israel and the troops facing them. Now, under such condition, some people say, okay, since there is, some people, not Michael Watson, I think, but some people would say, but if I'm wrong, he'll correct me in a few minutes. Since there is a possibility that non-combatants are in that house, then troops must be sent in order to search for those non-combatants and then fight the enemy. Hence, troops will face risk. They're being sent into a house where terrorists operate against them and against Israeli citizens. I think that under normal conditions, this is a bad answer. I mean, the state should not send its troops into a house under such circumstances. It means, just think about the situation. Okay, those people in the house shell Israelis, and Qassams are go on falling in Israeli places, near Sderot and the kibbutzim near Sderot and other places. That's the situation. Now starting a slow infantry and armor and engineering operation in order to capture that building and search all its floors and then fight the terrorists would mean that during that operation those terrorists go on shelling Sderot and the other neighborhoods, which means that Israelis are jeopardized while you perform this military activity. This means that priority is given to protecting the life of the non-combatant neighbors of the terrorists over protecting the life of Israeli citizens. Now, no sane state is going to allow its troops to operate under the guidance of such a principle, of giving preference to protecting the life of citizens of another state over the life of its own state. Assume that even the numbers, although they're not important theoretically, but assume for the rhetorical sake that even the numbers are the same. So the just war doctrine and the conventions of international law allow under such circumstances to give preference to considerations that are related to protection of your own citizens when you are a state over the life of the neighbors of the terrorists or the soldiers whom you fight. So the idea, in Hebrew it's aniyei ircha kodmi, which is another type of circumstance. The poor people of your town should be given preference from your point of view over the poor people of the neighboring town, of another town. So there are special duties, okay, from a moral point of view, which should indeed be applied as much as possible. I mean, a human being is a human being. When we speak about human dignity, we speak about human dignity, not civil dignity. It's the human dignity of every human being, not just our citizens that must be protected. And our fundamental law is called human kvod ha'adam. It's the human dignity, not the human dignity of citizens. It's human dignity. However, when there is a clash, and you must make up your mind who has the upper hand, because you cannot respect both to the same extent, then there is a special duty of a state to prefer its own citizens over others. However, it must do a lot in order to minimize collateral damage. The fact that I prefer my citizens over those who are not my citizens, and I don't have effective control where they reside, it's not my duty to separate them from the terrorists. And under such circumstances, there is a moral justification for preferring the citizens of my state over the others. And here is the consequence I'd like to start drawing. My troops, my men and women in military uniform, are also my citizens. So while preferring citizens coming from citizens of my state over citizens or non-combatants of another place where I am not in effective control, then I may use such preference considerations. Now think about a similar situation, and here I think is the major disagreement, when those people in the building do not shell the citizens of Israel, but just the troops. They fire the troops and not Israelis in the Sderot and other places. Under typical circumstances, it would be wrong to my mind to send the troops into those buildings in order to search for people who stay there. Now there is a system of warnings, I assume, that has been applied to the people in the neighborhood, in the building, and it's graded in time, which means there are leaflets that are distributed days earlier, and then there are telephone calls made hours earlier, and then there is the knock on the roof procedure, which is applied minutes earlier. But there is a graded system of warnings, and there are people that everyone has been warned. One may presume that everyone has been warned. Now, who stays there? Who goes on staying after having been warned? The terrorists. I'm not interested in them, generally speaking, because they are the enemy and I have the absolute right to fight my enemies. Then non-combatants who intend to be human shields. Okay, they are of moral interest to me, but since they voluntarily render themselves part of the enemy force by being a human shield, then okay, they may be killed, although minimizing collateral damage minimize damage among them is also something I'd like to take into account. Then there are non-combatants who cannot leave, which means warning was not effective concerning them. There we have a problem, and our methods of warning should take into account the inability of some people to leave, and there should be ways to handle that. I don't want to go into details. Now there are non-combatants who do not have where to go, so we hear, that's a legend. When we speak in terms of the Gaza Strip or southern Lebanon, everyone has a place where one can reside temporarily and safely and then return home after the operation has been concluded. Then there are people who are non-combatants, not related to terrorism, who stay for personal reasons. Something like they are afraid to leave because the apartment is going to be looted. Now, those people are at the center of the disagreement, and my view is that soldiers should not be jeopardized in order to save the life of those people who decided to stay for personal reasons. Not because of inability on the one hand, and not because of joining the terrorists on the other hand, but because of some personal reason. They love the furniture. Okay, so I don't despise them. I understand them. It's a very natural human attitude towards one's possessions, particularly in poor neighborhoods. However, the issue is not whether I understand it. The issue is whether this is a good justification for jeopardizing the life of the soldiers. And the answer is definitely not. Because a state owes its soldiers compelling reasons for jeopardizing the life and saving the life of a person who has been warned again and again and again and again and decided not to leave because of some personal reason. I mean, that's not a compelling reason for jeopardizing the life of troops. And I think that on certain occasions, this is how the troops acted, and they should be commended for it. Now, there are usual counter-arguments I'd like to mention very briefly in conclusion. The soldiers are sometimes told, okay, not by Professor Walzer, but by others. Some of the answers are also shared by Michael Walzer, but some are not. The primitive ones are not. Okay, so if you look at combatants and non-combatants in conflict, then the non-combatants should have the upper hand. I mean, that's just begging the question. I mean, the soldier keeps asking, why should that be the case? I mean, why should the non-combatants have the upper hand? You owe me, and now you is my state. My state owes me an answer. Why do you prefer non-combatants, whoever they are, over me when problems of life and death are under consideration? Telling him, because you're combatant. So, I mean, it's still begging the question, so what if I'm combatant? So why is a combatant? And why is a combatant a person who is treated like an instrument of participating in such activities, and one who ought to jeopardize one's life under such conditions. Now, some people say, okay, it's your profession, the profession of combatants. There are here two comments that should be made. In Israel, combatants are hardly professional combatants if they are conscripts. It's very remote from, they are as professional as possible. I mean, this is the way they are instructed and trained. However, they're not real professionals, and you cannot tell them, okay, you accepted that profession, and therefore, like a physician or a lawyer, and therefore you have to abide by its principles. Third comment, and second comment, again, it's begging the question: why should my profession include, per definition of my profession, my duty to jeopardize my life when that person who is afraid about his apartment being looted is under consideration? It's again begging the question. Then people tell us that, I finish in a minute, people tell us that you have to jeopardize your life in order to be moral. Okay, we would like our troops to act morally. But again, it sounds a perfect answer, right? But it's a very weak answer, because it's again begging the question: why is that moral? To jeopardize the life of the troops under such circumstances, and to give preference to the person afraid of looting his apartment over the life of a person in military uniform, who nevertheless is a citizen and has the right for his life being protected. So in conclusion, I think that we don't really, and that's a problem in just war doctrine and in all the conventions of international law related to such issues. I mean, there is a problem of facing circumstances of fighting terror, fighting terrorist organizations or terrorist guerrilla militias like the Hamas or Hezbollah, but that's a grave problem, but I don't mean that. There is a deeper problem of the attitude shown by just war doctrine and the way it is interpreted in different places and in different periods, and the attitudes of conventional international law and even customary international law to the human dignity of combatants. Combatants should not be killed by using excessively painful ammunition. That's for the combatants, and that's very important. Combatants who are prisoners of war should be treated well. That's very important, and I respect it very much. Combatants who are wounded should be treated properly as wounded persons. That's perfectly all right, and when it is exercised. So there are some rights that combatants have, but on the other hand, they are really treated as sort of an instrument, although no democracy nowadays would use this horrible, the state would not use this horrible term, but many in the arguments use this kind of term in order to describe the role played by combatants during wars. So this is a problem. I mean, how are we going to protect in a justifiable way the human dignity of people in military uniform, combatants in particular? That's a major issue.
Thank you very much for Professor Kasher for the intriguing lecture.